thank you everybody for being here. This is a really cool turnout, so very appreciative of this. If you have any questions at any point, don't hesitate to raise your hand. And I like to keep things kind of very dynamic. I'm not big on academic presentations, so we tried to kind of go find all sorts of information about how the payment processing works in general, and kind of demystify some of this, and then we're going to go through different points. And if there are some that you find interesting that you'd like to have us develop maybe into a future presentation, so to just kind of dig deeper into this, don't hesitate to let us know. Perfect. So a little bit of background information to kind of explain all the different actors in the chain of making a payment. So you have a consumer who you can consider to be the person purchasing a service or a product. You have a merchant, which is the one that's actually offering the service and expecting the money in exchange. You have what's called an issuer and an acquirer. The issuer is the financial institution that provides the consumer with a payment method, so the one where you went to get your credit card or where you have your bank account. And you have the acquirer, which is the financial institution where the merchant banks, so where they have their bank account and where the money will be transferred once you complete your transaction. You have what's called a gateway and a processor. The gateway and the processor are often used interchangeably, even though they're not necessarily the same thing. The gateway is the technological stack of tools that verifies and authenticates a payment method. So that's where the authorization process goes. The processor is the one that's actually responsible for the transfer of funds between issuer and acquirer. And the last one is card networks, right? Visa, MasterCard, Amex. They have a role to play in the authorization, in the verification, and in the transaction process when you're dealing with cards. So when you're dealing with either credit cards or credit-backed debit cards, like Visa, MasterCard, debit cards. Perfect. So there are two interesting concepts when you're either looking for a provider or when you're deciding to get into the payment space. The first one is what's called the merchant of record. And the second one that we're going to see in one slide is payment facilitator, or PayFacs. The merchant of record is essentially the one whose name you'll see on the invoice, right? That's the entity that's responsible for the entire risk chain in the transaction process. So if you think of Airbnb, if you think of Uber, and if you think of short-term rental, say, providers, and you think of drivers versus riders and guests, what Airbnb and Uber do is they provide the entire infrastructure, and they provide the entire payment processing. They provide all the fraud tools, all the complaint management tools, all the risk checks, all the detection process, because it's a lot more interesting to deal with an entity like this, legitimately speaking, than to go directly to a driver or directly to somebody who owns a condo. And what Uber does in this case, or Airbnb do, or a merchant of record in general, is they're going to set up all the relationships with the different banks and with the processors. So they're going to deal with PCI compliance. They're going to deal with all the technological stack that's required to support things like vaulting and so on, right? Because as an individual driver, you can't possibly manage all of these things. Payment facilitators, they kind of came out when people wanted to get into the payment space without dealing with all these complicated processes, right? So if you take Stripe and PayPal as an example, what Stripe will do is Stripe will set themselves up in the middle of the process. So Stripe will, again, like the merchant of record, set up the relationships with the banks and the processors and so on. And Stripe will allow independent service or like vendors to come in, create what's called a partner account, and start onboarding themselves sub-merchants. So you could consider Stripe placed here, and then you could have like a Shopify as an ISV that's onboarded as a partner under Stripe, and then Shopify under them brings in sub-merchants. So brings in cupcake stores and like a doggy spa and daycares and all these little institutions that want to be able to take online payments or card payments, but don't want to have to manage the process. And where the PayFac model is interesting is there's a lot more volume for Stripe because of the fact that they're let's say, sub-merchant agnostic. They can pretty much accept anybody that satisfies their risk profile. So they can take all of that volume and they can go to those different banks and processors and suppliers, and they can negotiate much better rates. So, which can either help the merchants or help Stripe, right? Because then they get more profit from the transactions. Does that make sense? Perfect. There are two models to consider. Like if you ever start getting into the payment space and if you want to start, say, onboarding processors or you want to offer services, you have to consider two different models. There's the fixed cost model and there's the what's called the pass-through model. The fixed cost model is providers like Stripe and Square and PayPal, where you have the same transaction cost for any type of credit card, any type of debit cards. Stripe will go 2.9% plus 30 cents, let's say. And they'll do that for any card, right? Whether it's like a Visa Elite concierge service or it's a no-frills student card that doesn't have any kind of points and any sort of services of any kind. And I mean, PayPal, I think, is 2.8% or Square is 2.8. Like, they're all pretty similar in that space. And if you want to get a better deal from a Stripe or a Square, then you have to bring in significant volume. The other one is the pass-through model, which is more transparent, where the provider shows you pretty much the entire portion of the fee structure. And the things that you're going to have to consider is what's called interchange, assessment, and processor fees. And this will change depending on the type of card, depending on the type of transaction you're making, depending on the sort of merchant you're making the transaction with. So very quickly, interchange fees is the biggest chunk of your processing. It's about 1 to 3% of the transaction, and it goes directly to the bank that issued the payment method, that issued the credit cards. And these fees are there for covering fraud and bad debt and overall risk of accepting an online transaction or even a card present, so in-store transaction. And like we said, it's 1 to 3%, and it's higher when you have more expensive or more service-heavy credit cards. Assessment fees are roughly 10 basis points, so 0.1%, and they go directly to the card networks. This is one of the way or the main way that they make their money, right? They don't necessarily make their money on you being late and them charging you interest, right? They make money on every single transaction. So at this point, you have interchange, you have assessment, and then you have processor. This is how Stripe gets paid here, right? This is how Adyen, Braintree, WorldPay, all of these guys get paid, is they have their own processing costs, which they show you. In this pass-through model, they tell you, on this credit card, you're gonna pay interchange, which might be whatever the credit card is. You're gonna pay assessment, which is 10 basis points. And you'll pay my fees, which are 20 basis points, 10 basis points, 30 basis points, whatever they might be. And this makes a very big difference when you're comparing the Stripe fixed, one sort of price model and the ones that are pass-through. The pass-through model, it means that you're going to pay a different amount of money on every single transaction if it comes through from a different card type or if it's like from a different merchant or in a different situation. This is an example. If you take a look at different types of cards, you have consumer cards, you have corporate cards, you have, like, if you take a look at the MasterCard World Elite, you have 2.5% interchange, and by the time you get to the end, it's at 2.85%, 2.85 plus 23 cents. Take a look at the Visa Corporate. At the end, with all the fees stacked up together, you're at about 3.05%. So it can go up, and depending on this type of business you have, if you feel like you're going to have a customer base that leans maybe more heavily towards the expensive cards, then it's possible that a Stripe is more advantageous for you, right? But there's a caveat. If you take debit cards, so if you take like your MasterCard or your Visa bank card, and you go, say, you take a look at the cost structure in the United States, for financial institutions that are considered regulated, so that have assets that are over $10 billion in management, the actual considered interchange fee is 5 basis points plus 21 cents. So it's 0.05% plus 21 cents. And for financial institutions that are smaller, so that are under $10 billion, so you consider the regional banks, the credit unions, the smaller banks, it's about 1.65. So with assessment, with processor fees, you're looking at 0.46 or 0.45 or 2%. But Stripe is still charging you 2.9%, right? So there's a lot of money to go get back, depending on what your profit margin is, depending on what the makeup of your customer base is, depending on what it is that you're selling. So it's a consideration to keep. Perfect. So we're going to take a look at the different payment methods that we've worked with and kind of how they operate. Before I do that, are there any questions? Perfect. So cards, which we've touched on a little bit with assessment and interchange, so credit cards and debit cards. EFT, which are bank transfers, and instant transfers. So think Interac and something called FedNow in the United States. Perfect. So card payments. The way that card payments work, it's a complicated synchronization between all the different actors that were presented. And while they appear instantaneous from the perspective of the user that's currently making a transaction, it is a little bit more complicated, and the funds do actually get settled later on. So it's two steps. First, you have something called authorization, and then you have something called settlement and clearing. And a payment gateway, which is essentially the iframe that you're typing your card into, is quasi-identical to a POS terminal when you go into a store and you tap your card on something, or you stick it in and you put in your card. Think of it as that. Those are the equivalent. So the way the authorization works is at the beginning, when you first put in your card information and you elect to pay, there's going to be a number of calls that are going to be made between the payment gateway, which is going to encrypt the information, send it over through to the processor, and then there's going to be a communication process between the processor, the issuing banks, and the card networks to determine that you are legitimately able to make this payment, that there's enough money in your account, that there's no risk of fraud, that nothing wrong is happening at this point. And it's going to go all the way back up to the gateway, which is going to communicate to the front end, or to, in the case of a POS, communicate to the actual customer that's looking at the terminal that the transaction has been accepted. At this point, no money's been transferred anywhere, right? All that's happened is that you have a successful completion to the transaction, and that as far as you're concerned, the merchant is done and the work is passed. What's going to happen then at the end of the day is all these transactions that have been authorized are going to be batched, and then they're going to be settled and cleared. So more or less the same process is going to happen between the payment processor and the card networks and the issuers and the acquirers in order to move the money essentially from the acquiring bank to the merchant's account, and then to move the money out of the consumer's account. So that's essentially how a card transaction works. Like it seems instantaneous, but it's only the authorization and the commitment that is done, and at the end of the day, everything is batched and processed. And I mean, if you take a look at it, in 2022 in the US, $3 trillion were processed in card payments.
Do you mind zooming a bit on the diagrams?
Yeah, of course. So this one is the authorization. If you look here, perfect. You'll notice that number 2, transaction info is transferred via the payment gateway to the processor. So the information essentially is encrypted at this point because of something called PCI compliance. You don't want to be able to intercept any sort of card information. And we'll talk about how we on the API side or on the server side handle this process later on. Card networks will transfer the info to the issuing bank, and then essentially it's all just going to go all the way back up, like we've discussed, to the front end to let the person know that the transaction was done correctly. And if you look on the other side, like we discussed, all the authorized transactions that were batched will go back through and then will essentially be settled. So the merchant account will pull the funds and place them in, the acquiring bank will place the funds into the merchant account, and then the funds will be debited from the issuing banks.
Is this an online payment?
Yes, but in the context of a card present, so in-store payment, it's pretty much the same. The only difference is you don't have a form like a payment gateway to type in your stuff. What you have is a terminal that you can either tap your card in, or that you can type in your PIN.
So you say that like there's a batch running at the end, like to transfer the funds to the merchant. So even though we see the money physically leaving our account, the merchant hasn't received it. That's what
Correct. Yeah. The money didn't physically leave your account. The money, the spending, your spending capability got reduced on your credit cards, right? In this case.
Is this credit card only?
It's the same idea for debit cards. For debit cards that are essentially backed by credit card networks.
So if you use your debit card online,
Mm-hmm.
you see your balance lowered on the spot, but
Yes.
the merchant hasn't received it yet. You will receive it at the end.
Yep, that's correct. Perfect. All right. So we wanted to show you an example of how this can be managed using Stripe. Stripe is probably the easiest thing to integrate, and there's a reason why they're worth what they're worth. And there's also a reason why they charge 2.9% plus 30 cents per transaction. So if you take a look at the Stripe form, one of the things we wanted to draw your attention on is that little checkbox, which is where you can save your payment method as a default. And this is something that if you're offering a e-commerce experience that you want to consider, because it allows you to reduce friction on subsequent transactions. So that somebody doesn't have to come back every time and kind of type in the same information that they're going to use anyways. And it increases your chance of getting conversion. In e-commerce is a lot more drastic, but in the context of getting anybody to make a payment, the less steps they have to go through, the higher the likelihood they're actually going to commit. And this is kind of an example. It's in the case of Stripe, when you come back, you could reuse your existing payment method, and all you would need to do is type in your security code or CVC. You wouldn't have to go through the process of putting in your card number, putting in your expiration date, and everything else. Perfect. So the way Stripe works, it's running on what's called a payment intent. So a payment intent is essentially a request to initiate and run a transaction. So when you come in first and you select credit cards, what you're going to need to do is you're going to create a payment intent. That intent or that request is going to go to Stripe. Stripe is going to return what's called a client secret or a payment token. And that client secret will be your ID for your payment, for your transaction request. So taking that client secret that you're going to get back in the front end, you're going to create a payment element. These are Stripe terminologies. You're going to create a payment element using that secret. And that payment element, when you mount it, it'll be your iframe. That's the form that your customer, your user is going to see, and that's where they're going to input their card information. Perfect. And then, in a second, I'm just going to. Perfect. And then once they submit and confirm, you're going to get a status back. Using the token, and then through webhooks, if I go back here, you're going to be able to get updated on the status of your payments. And subscribing, so the webhooks are interesting. We're going to talk about that in a bit. The webhooks allow you to deal with payment statuses that could come in after if the front end is not available to receive the information as well. So in some cases, you might get some timeouts, which we've seen situations where the browser drops off for some reason, and then you've executed the transaction, but you haven't actually received the response in the browser, and so you've not created the payment yourself, but the card was still tapped, and the funds were still pulled, and you still had a transaction created on the Stripe side, but on the side of your system, you've missed it. So that's why dealing with webhooks is important, because it allows you to make sure that you don't lose any information. Perfect. So this is essentially creating a payment intent. And if you look at the information, the automatic payment methods enabled true, it means that you're able to create a checkout iframe that simultaneously offers every single supported payment wallet. Or you could specify with a different option to only show cards, only show ACH, only show Klarna and Afterpay, and then BNPL type options where somebody can actually purchase an asset but pay for it over a certain amount of installments. This would be the response you get back from a payment intent call, and you can see here your client secret, which is what you're going to use to create your element afterwards. Oh, and also an ID. Perfect. If you look here, you already have a payment method ID, which will represent your tokenized payment method. So one of the main reasons of using a payment service like Stripe or Square or Adyen or anything else like that is that you yourself don't have to manage the burden of PCI compliance. You don't have to deal with taking in and processing card information, which if you did do, you'd have to go through a significant amount of audits and infrastructure work to make sure that you're vaulting, so that you're storing the information correctly and that it's encrypted and that it's inaccessible to pretty much anybody. So by using an iframe, you make sure that there's no way to intercept what's happening and that you only have access to a payment token or tokenized payment method that alone is just, if you could see this, like random strings that has no value outside of the context of the specific operation you're doing for that specific merchant. Perfect. So if you look at, this is an example of the front-end code. So essentially you create your payment intent. You wait for the client secret to come back through the response. Right over here. You go through your payment element, which you create. And this is essentially where you mount it. So at this point is where your iframe appears on the screen. And this is standard error handling. And this can be interesting if you're trying to redirect somebody to an additional page. This would be the function that runs on the actual submission. So when your user or your customer clicks on the submit button after they've put on all the information in, and this is essentially how you're able. No, I went back. Apologies. Perfect. And this is how you're capable of going afterwards to retrieve your payment intent using your client secrets and act on any kind of payment status if you want to display a message to the user that's currently watching the screen. This is an example of the webhooks that are supported. So the ones that you want to take a look at will normally be things like...
Do you mind defining what a webhook is for people that are...
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Okay. So when we talked about processing webhooks, what we mean is processing status updates that come back directly from the provider. So in this case, Stripe. You're making a transaction call to Stripe. So you're making a direct call and you're getting a response through the iframe. But you can also get status updates directly from webhooks, which is essentially Stripe sending a payload to a URL that you're listening on. So on your side, in your system, You have routes that are defined that you go and you configure in your Stripe account or in your ADN account or in your WorldPay account, and this is the endpoint that Stripe will hit to send you updates, so send you events as they happen. So this is kind of a way of processing real-time events without having to do a fetch every time, like having a timer where you're doing a get every 5 seconds to see if anything changed. So a good example would be if you're going through a transaction where you're going to first do what's called an authorization request, and then you're going to do something called a capture. An authorization is when you confirm that you have what's necessary to use the payment method, that you have the right card number, right expiration dates, there's no risk of fraud. If you have something called address validation, where you have to send the address that's associated to the card, then you'll send the address, and then you'll confirm that it's the right address, right? That you are authorized to use this payment method. Once you have your authorization, you will do a capture, which is essentially saying I'm closing the transaction on this amount. And that's how you complete the transaction. So you could be listening on charge captured, charge failed, and charge succeeded. And then you have the whole life cycle of your transaction. And an interesting thing about webhooks is if you support refunds, or if you have a situation of chargebacks or disputes, right? Somebody 15 days later could say, no, I never wanted to buy this, and they dispute with the merchant, and then they win their case, and then they get a refund, or they get a chargeback or whatever. Then if you don't have webhook capabilities, you're not going to receive that feedback. You're not going to get that event. So what Stripe's going to do 10 days later is they're going to create an event that they're going to send to your webhook URL or webhook endpoint. And then you're going to get this saying, oh, this payment that I thought was actually successful 10 days ago is now failed. So you'll have to process it and update your system or update your records. Yes?
Sorry, why would you have a checkbox depending on the webhook?
Say that again?
Why would you have checkbox?
What would we have checkboxed?
Yeah, why not just to have all of them?
I mean, it depends. It's a good point. It depends what you support. It depends. For example, it depends on how fast you. Yeah, it depends on how fast you want to go to production. It depends on how complicated you want your product to be. It depends on how your process works. Like if you're making a direct API call for authorization, then you're going to get your authorization response in your API call anyways, right? So it might be overkill to listen for an event like that if that was there. But yeah, it's up to you. Yeah.
Well, just complementing his answer, I think that the reason why you don't enable every checkbox is that I think if you start calling webhook, Stripe is gonna call that URL by every event, right? And if you don't set a general URL for everything of them, then Stripe will tell you that probably your URL is going to be failing, and you're gonna get a message for that.
Sorry, I'm not.
No, sorry. To explain it better, it's not the best option to enable all the events, because if you don't set a correct URL which answers to that event,
Sure.
then Stripe in that case will start communicating you that for this event, this URL is not receiving a successful response.
Sure.
Right? And I think that's one of the reasons why you don't enable from the first day every.
Oh,
every
okay. I see
event.
what you're saying. Okay, sure. But I mean, once you know that your implementation is correct.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Yes.
Yes, question regarding the risk profile. So for every purchase, so when a person makes a purchase on the site, you have a risk profile. You could have someone that I guess is more risky, and I'm guessing Stripe has some algorithm to determine the risk profile of the person based on the CVV and the address. They can kind of tell if this looks like a risky transaction or not. Can you set the risk level at the merchant level? Can you say?
I believe that that's something that you can set at the underwriting level. So when you open up, so I don't know about Stripe specifically, but I know that a lot of providers will allow you to do things like sending out an IP address whenever you make a transaction, and using the IP address, the provider itself will do some analysis and determine whether or not that IP falls in a risk category, right? And a lot of those tools, especially Stripe, will do fraud analysis on their side, right? Because they have access to all the data points. They have a tremendous amount of transactions that are going through them from different providers. So they're able to they're able to categorize a lot better. And and a lot of additional services do that as well. I don't know if when you open up a merchant account, you can go and select, I only want to allow non-risky transactions, or I only want to allow transactions that have a risk score below something. But as a merchant, you get yourself a risk evaluation, right? When you're underwritten, when you go through what's called AML, so anti-money laundering, and KYC, which is know your customers. This is where the gateway, or rather the processor, the gateway, the provider, essentially assesses your risk profile, right? And says, like, do I think that there will be a lot of chargebacks coming from this customer? Do I think that there will be a lot of fraud attempts coming from this customer? And the reason why they don't want to allow customers that have a higher risk profile is chargebacks. If they get too much chargebacks, at some point they can get problems from the card networks. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The merchants will have a limit, so if it's too high, they don't want the card networks don't want to work with these merchants.
Correct. So, for example, a good example is collection agencies. Collection agencies will have a lot of difficulty opening up a merchant account at a payment gateway because they're very high in risk. Yes.
So there are quite a number of these payment processors, like there's Stripe, Adyen. So what makes a company choose one over the other? Is it transaction costs, or is it speed, simplicity?
It depends, right? It could be anywhere from integration capabilities, like for example, Stripe, you can plug them into literally anything, right?
Right.
They're compatible with probably every marketplace that's out there, and every type of WordPress, and
Which is why they're so popular.
So that's one thing. And then another reason why you might pick another provider is they might have payment methods that others don't, right? Let's say you want to support Alipay, you want to support some payment methods in Brazil, you want to support something else in China or who knows where, then you're going to go somewhere different. And then, like he mentioned, is risk. Some gateways have a lower risk tolerance, right? So if you're not in a specific box, they're going to reject you outright. And then the final point can be something like cost, right? Stripe 2.9% plus 30 cents. It's not cheap, right? And then, like we saw, the actual cost of debit cards in the US is anywhere from 0.4 to 2% after you factor in processor fees. So there's a lot to consider depending on what your margins are.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. This is what's called, so this is an example of what's called a setup intent. So it's essentially the same thing as Stripe's payment intent, but where it differs is it allows you to capture a payment method without actually creating a transaction. So this can be for a buy now, pay later sort of use case. This can be for, let's say somebody tells you that, I'm going to get paid because you're sending them a bill for a service, and they're saying, I'm going to get paid on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday next week. Here's my card. I'll give you the information, but bill me on Thursday. So you create a setup intent, and the setup intent comes back to you with a tokenized payment method. And then when the time comes, you create your transaction using the setup intent. You can correct me anytime, Andy, by the way.
Yeah, I worked on that.
Feel free to jump in.
No, you nailed it.
Thank you.
And that's the same concept with canceling the payment, like a few days after you, let's say you order on Amazon, they give you the choice to cancel it, let's say a day after you place the order.
What do you mean by the same concept?
Same concept as in the transaction is not really
correct. So you can
at the
you can look at it as essentially just an authorization. So there's some gateways support $0 authorization. Some you have to do a 1 cent authorization. Some they do like a void. They just kind of check that the card is valid. But I think in this case, if you're talking about buying something in the future, for a certain amount, then you're going to do probably an authorization against the amount that you want to make sure that the money's there, right? And then you can just void the authorization so that you don't you release the funds, right? Because when you authorize, you do a pre-auth on a credit card, you're actually holding up that payment space, right? So this is essentially a how to create a setup intent, pretty similar to a payment intent. Response is again pretty similar. Where it differs is you're not going to have a payment method token that's sent back, but you still have a client secret. Which you can see.
Yeah, this is after capture.
Oh yeah,
This
correct.
one
Sorry. So
should
this one you
the
have the
token.
payment method. There it is. Apologies. So you've got your payment method back here after the capture. And this is just the webhooks that you can subscribe to as it relates to the payment intents.
That's setup intents.
Setup intent, sorry. Thank you, Andy. So we've seen cards. The other type of payment that is interesting to have is EFTs, which are electronic fund transfers. And those are interesting because they're also the cheapest kind of transaction you can support. It's literally pennies to make an EFT transaction, and they're the most widely used type of transactions. So think wire transfers, direct deposits, ATM transactions. In the US, there's a thing called ACH, which is a form of EFT. ACH is, well, we'll talk about it in the next slide.
Automatic clearinghouse.
Yeah. Automated clearinghouse. And it's also, like if you take a look at how much is processed, you're looking at $72.6 trillion in the US processed last year in ACH transactions. So it's pretty big. What's interesting is it's very low fee. It's a very low cost thing to do, but there's a delay in the system, right? You have same day ACH, but generally you're looking at 24 to 72 hours for the transfer to be completed. And then you got to factor in things like bank holidays and sometimes weekends. So there's that consideration to have. So the way it works, it's essentially when you come in to make your EFT transaction and you commit to it.
Zooming on the diagram.
Yeah, apologies.
No, mind.
Of course. And you actually commit to the transaction. So it's like if you click submit on the form, then you create an order that's added to the system, and that order is added to a queue or a batch. And what happens is at preset times during the day and more during the weekend, that batch gets executed by the financial institution and the fund transfer actually gets completed. So because of this delay between the time you say, yes, I want to pay, and the funds are actually tapped, what can happen is the money can actually no longer be available, right? You could make another transaction, you could pay another bill, some other fund transfer might pass. So this is where webhooks become interesting, especially in this case. It's that you're not going to get a complete confirmation on the spot ever. You're going to all you're going to know is that you have a pending order that's in the system, right? You're going to need to consume webhooks to know if this order passed or failed in the next 24 to 72 hours. So this is an example of how Stripe manages EFT, and there's an interesting spin on it that you can add to make the process a bit more, let's say, a bit more user-friendly for people. So if you take a look at the first form, this is a sandbox EFT form. It allows you to select test institutions and fail your transaction or not. But if you take a look on the right, that's what's called aggregation, and there are a lot of providers like Plaid that do this. Aggregation allows you to add a layer on top of your form, where a user would otherwise just enter like their account number, their routing number, their institution number. With aggregation, they can select from a list of supported FIs, financial institutions, and they can essentially enter their credentials, like if they're logging into their bank account, pick an account, and then just confirm. So it's almost as simple as a credit card, You don't have to go and pull out a checkbook, and you don't have to go and look for account numbers and all these annoying little things that nobody wants to do. And there's a cost with aggregation. Usually you want to consider that like every aggregation hit can be anywhere from 50 cents to $1 depending on the volume that you have. But EFT is also almost limitless. EFT is like you could make an EFT transaction for $50,000 if you wanted, right? That really depends on your business model, obviously. Whereas credit card is very risk-based and has limits that are much lower than that generally.
Sorry, I have a
Shoot.
question while we're talking on this. So this is cheaper from a transactional standpoint.
Yes.
Are there different fraud considerations? Because I know for things like, let's say, Interact e-transfer, if I send money, that's it, the money's gone.
Yes, you're
I
never getting
cannot-
it back.
I cannot get
Nope,
it back. So
never.
there's no fraud consideration there. What about EFT and ACH?
I can't say that I've ever had an EFT transaction that was stopped for fraud reasons. But I would imagine that at the bank level, they probably do their own checks, right?
Mhm.
Because you're not hitting a card network, you're going directly, you're adding an order directly that's going to be executed by a financial institution. But at the aggregation level, so providers like I said, Plaid, there's I think Finicity, MX, a lot of these different, they have their own fraud capabilities as well. So they have services where they can do an aggregation of the transactions that are happening and kind of give you an idea of do we think that something is going on or not. But you have a lot less control than, or a lot less oversight than you would with a credit card.
Right. Because my understanding is that the banks charge a lot, mostly because there's the risk that this will be charged back and they need
Yes.
to cover in part of it. I'm wondering if the fees here are much lower because chargeback is not a consideration at all.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that we haven't seen that many chargebacks, so I would think that it's a lot less risky. Whereas online is probably the most expensive type of transaction to support, because it's kind of easy to grab. It's kind of easy to grab credit card numbers. It's a lot harder to find an account number and a routing number. It's probably harder to get access to somebody's banking credentials as well. And then the way that these things work mostly is with screen scraping. So there's not a lot of API coverage between banks and the outside world. So the way a provider like this operates, like Plaid and all these guys, is they'll literally take your credentials that you're inputting and they'll plug them into the actual portal. And they'll scrape the screen, they'll pull all the information that's displayed, and then they'll package it into something like this where they can show you all your available accounts, and then you pick the one you want, and then once you've picked an account and you've committed, this is where they're going to pull that information. They're going to go pull those routing numbers, those account numbers, those institution numbers, and they're going to package them back into a token, which you will use to execute your transactions. So you're still vaulting a payment method. So you're still storing securely all that information. You're getting a token back. And with that token, you're executing your transactions. Does that make sense?
Are there limits to credit card transaction, even if the card limit has not been reached?
I believe that during underwriting, you may have credit card limits on the transactions that are set at the gateway level for reasons of risk. So even if your credit card can go up to $20,000, maybe your merchant account can't charge that much on your credit card.
You'll be forced to do multiple transactions then.
I mean, it depends on what you're selling, right? If you're selling things that have, that has a very high cost, then yeah, you could go with like installment plans where you can break things down into pieces, or BNPLs where you can do that. BNPL is buy now, pay later, so you can, which can also split things, usually splits it into installments. But obviously, the more expensive the transaction is, the higher the fraud oversight is, right?
So this is the limit from the merchant or the bank itself.
Sorry?
The limit, is it the limit from the merchant or from the card issuer?
I mean, there's a limit at the card issuing side, right? But there's probably also a limit at the processor merchant account side.
Okay.
And that one can be much lower than the one that your card has.
Yeah, just two questions regarding for EFT. I was wondering how secure it is from a customer perspective. guess this is captured behind the
Correct.
scene by Stream. So I was
By,
wondering.
by Stripe? No, Stripe doesn't get that information. So if you're using aggregation, the credentials are captured by the aggregation service provider, so by Plaid or by whoever it is, and then Stripe itself will not really get that info. What you're going to get back is, unless Stripe is the one offering the service, that's a different thing. I think it might be Stripe has their own sort of aggregation process, if I'm not mistaken. I believe they do, because they used to use Plaid before and now they don't use it anymore. But let's say you use Plaid. Plaid is the one capturing the credentials, so Plaid is the one that is responsible, that has the burden of security. So I would say these companies spend a ton of money on security and on audits, on infrastructure reviews. So yes, there's a risk. There's a risk, but it's often mitigated by the measures they put in place. Sure. Perfect. So now in this situation, you've selected your account, you've connected, you've authenticated, you've picked where you want the money to come from, and then now you come back to Stripe, and then you can just confirm and pay. And this is where you're adding your order into the queue that's going to be batch processed at some point.
Also in that screen, the one, yes, that one, at the bottom where it says by saving your bank account for business name, that is basically a mandate that is displayed to the customer to agree with for legal compliance.
Correct, yeah.
And Stripe handles that automatically with their Stripe Element API.
Yeah, so there are a lot of regulations that you have to cover when you deal with payments, depending on which geography or jurisdiction you're executing those payments in. And in some cases, for credit cards, for example, if you're not making a recurrent payment, so if there's no subscription, then you might be required to show people that they have the option to refuse storing their credit card information, right? If you're putting them into a subscription plan, then there's a terms and conditions thing you want to show that by agreeing to the terms of this, you are allowing us to charge you on a recurring basis, and so on and so on and so on. So there are a lot of different things you want to consider when you start playing with payments, but often the gateways will take care of that for you and will let you know what you need to configure and what you need to support.
And also when the user agrees with it, Stripe will store the mandate agreement as an ID that's tokenized and will return a token for us to verify that the customer agreed to this ACH payment.
Mm. So we saw card payments, we saw bank transfers. There's types of bank transfers or bank payments that are still considered kind of instantaneous. So there's something called FedNow that's starting in the US, and there's Interac in Canada, which is a good example. So the way, and if you take a look at on top right how much money FedNow processes, you'll see that it's a lot less widespread than EFT. FedNow processed 19.7 billion in the Q3 of 2022. So if you're generous and you multiply that by 5, it's 100 billion versus 72 trillion that were processed with EFT. So a distinction with something called FedNow is the banks need to subscribe to it to have it available. It's not a given. And the way it works is that you have the Federal Reserve that sits in the middle of every financial institution, has access to every single account. So the Federal Reserve has offered a service that you can call to execute quasi-instantaneous bank transfers between supported financial institutions, which is very comparable to what we have here with Interac. And for those of you who didn't know, Interac was actually founded by most of our banks, most of our big banks. I think it was in the 80s. So. So a couple of caveats when you're dealing with payments and payment providers is if you only have one, let's say, payment gateway, you're only going to use Stripe, then you're good. But if you want to offer multi-gateway support, so if you want your customers to be able to come to you and say, well, I have an ADN account, I have a Braintree account, I have an authorized.net account. If you want to be able to support all those, then you're going to be stuck building out all these integrations, and you're going to be stuck maintaining them and testing them and making sure that when the API versioning changes and that something happens on their side that you have to be on top of it and you have to update your code base. Or you can use what's called aggregators. So you have open source and you have obviously paying services. So an aggregator is something that allows you to standardize the transaction mechanism while communicating to multiple providers. So Stripe has its way of operating, Square has its way of operating. All of these different providers have their own APIs and documentation. But you use an aggregator that will expose a single sort of set of methods, and then you're going to call these methods, and on the back end, the aggregator is going to manage the complexity of communicating with the different providers. A good example of this, open source, is Active Merchant. Active Merchant was essentially designed by Shopify and is now maintained by the community, and I think is also maintained by one of the paying services, which we're going to see in a bit. And this is interesting because, number one, it's very easy to add additional support if it's missing. So let's say you want to, there's one called Repay. You want to support Repay, but Active Merchant doesn't. It's very easy for you to extend the capabilities of Active Merchant and add support for an additional gateway, and then you can continue the process. Where you might have some complexity is, number one, it's not maintained necessarily by professional oversight. It's maintained by the community. It's maintained by it's maintained based on priority too, right? If you have something that's obscure that only you use but nobody else does, then nobody is going to be playing in that sandbox. And the other thing is, as an example, Active Merchant doesn't manage the front end complexities. Active Merchant only covers the API calls. If you still have to do your own work for the different iframes, so you still have some work to do and you still have some maintenance to do. You can use a paying service. So a paying service, good examples are Spreedly, IXOPay, Rapid. And those services are built around supporting compatibility with different payment gateways, but there's a price, right? So first off, they support the whole process. They support the API calls, they support the iframes. So you're only making a call to one provider, but you can configure it for multiple gateways. So you can essentially support all sorts of merchant accounts without having to do the work yourself. You only work with the one. You only work with Rapid or Spreedly. The expectation is they're going to stay on top of changes, so you won't have to maintain this yourself. But like we mentioned, pricing. Imagine you're going through 3,000 payments per month, right? For one customer. You're a service provider. You onboard sub-merchants, like you have a cupcake store, and then you onboard them onto your platform so they can sell their merchandise. And they run through 3,000 transactions per month. Each transaction goes through 2 API calls and 1 vaulting call. So 1 call to store the payment method and return a payment token that you can use. That's 3 API calls, 2 cents each, 3,000 transactions, you're paying $180 a month. So you're paying $180 a month to maintain that customer, plus you have a monthly probably licensing fee just to use the service. So depending on the kind of margins you have, this is something you want to consider, right? It might reduce your profits by a lot. Another one, yes, please.
Also, Spreedly will
Yes.
still require developers to implement webhooks separately.
That's correct. So we've done some work with Spreedly, and Spreedly, one of the drawbacks is that they do not support webhooks. So if you remember EFT transactions or bank transfers, the bank transfer, once you confirm the payment, all you know is it's pending. You still have to wait a day or 2 or 3 to receive either the failure or the success event back. And that event comes in under the form of a webhook. Spreedly does not support transmitting webhooks across providers. So the webhook will come in, say, from Stripe to Spreedly, and will stop there. So you may find yourself, like one alternative that we haven't necessarily explored is that you may have to create polling. You may have to check back regularly with Spreedly to see how's the transaction doing. Is it good? Is it good? Is it good? Is it good? Until you get a response, right? Which is inefficient. Another caveat when you're dealing with mobile payments is that you have a lot of providers or a lot of types of wallets that will generate a secondary experience. So you're on your phone, they're on your web app, they're going through to the payment step, and then say they select Interac. Interac is a good example. You click on Interac, it opens up a pop-up, which you see here, on the browser that allows you to select your financial institution. And then once you select your institution, if the mobile app is installed on your device, it opens the mobile app. So you're now on the mobile app, you're completing the payments. Once you're done, what generally happens is you close everything because you think my work is done, I've paid for my cupcakes, I can go home. So you close everything, and then nothing goes back to the browser. So your web app never gets the confirmation the payment was made. You have to entirely rely on webhooks, right? Otherwise, you'll never know something was done. Now, where you can have a collision is if you're on a desktop or if the person goes back to the browser and then you get the confirmation, then you might be set up at the browser level to create the payment there because you're receiving the payload back. And so you're also getting a webhook at the same time that comes in to tell you a payment was created. So you have your front end that may be creating a payment, and you have a webhook that might be getting processed at the same time. Yes, Andy?
Sorry, this is independent of what you talked about regarding Spreedly.
Sure. Yes. Yes. Apologies if I wasn't clear. This is independent of Spreedly.
One thing that I wanted to mention about Spreedly, not having webhooks means we could do polling, but also it means alternatively we could still integrate with Stripe's webhooks separately.
That's a good point.
That would be extra work.
And it would defeat the purpose of using Spreedly because you're now still maintaining an integration with every provider. It's maybe not as involved of an integration, but you still have to go and build a client and you still have to build support. Well, maybe not. You have to build support anyways for the webhook formats that come in, and should they change the payload format, then you have to go and maintain. So it defeats the point of having to pay 3 cents per transaction to go and still build an integration with the provider. Yes?
You mentioned you play around with Spreedly.
Yes.
But you also mentioned that you use Stripe, so your business
we've played around with a whole lot of payment gateways.
Have you ever used both in production, or this was just an investigation to see?
No, we haven't used those in production.
Okay.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, so to tell you a bit about us, initially the way we work is that, or we still work, is we support our customers' gateways, right? We don't enforce necessarily anything. We have partnerships, and then we have a very good knowledge of how gateways work and how providers work, and we're able to sort of suggest the ones that fit best with our customers should they need it. But generally, we don't add that friction to the process, the onboarding process.
And could you give us examples of the different gateways that Lexop supports?
Sure. You can think of, let's say, Bonaris, Square, Vopay, Zoom, WorldPay, Worldline, Repay, Plenty, Eigen. There's a bunch of them, to be honest. So I was talking about, so you have to be careful when you're in a situation where you have a webhook coming in that's signaling a new payment, and you're also in the process of dealing with a payload that came back to the browser telling you that a new payment was completed. So in some cases, you don't want to get stuck creating duplicates. And then one of the ways you could address this is you could either lock the table or you could lock the records. And then you'd make sure, and then if you lock the record, whoever comes first is the one that gets to create the payment, and then the one that comes after, you have enough information in the payment you've created to determine that you're not trying to create the exact same payment. So you can just ignore that duplicate. Yes? Did you raise? I thought you moved your hand, sorry. Perfect. Does that make sense? Good. These are some interesting links in case you guys want to go and read up on how payments work. And thank you. Do you have any questions? Anything you want to? Yes.
All the cases are going to be in one case, like when sometimes we use card or maybe in India, we are also using UPI. So I tap the card, the payment is deducted, but we receive the failure. The payment is deducted, but we receive the failure. So how they manage to after credit the amount again in the bank?
Sorry, when you say the payment is directed, but you receive a failure, what do you mean?
The amount is deducted from my card.
Okay, so it's okay.
Yeah, but I receive the failure from the API. Sometimes it's happen. Like,
Sure.
It's happened. So they also credit after maybe after 24 or 72 hours. They after they credit the amount in the bank. It's deducted before, but I see the failure in the API call. But
Okay.
after they also send a message if the amount is deducted, but you see failure. But they 24 72 hours.
Sure.
They credit again the amount in the bank. So how they handle
That sounds like an authorization. It sounds like you tapped your card, the money, the transaction was authorized, so the funds were held,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So the spending space on your credit card just decreased by that amount.
Yeah.
And then 72 hours to 24 to 72 hours later, what banks or cards will normally do is they release authorizations that are not captured, right? So the space comes back. Where you have a problem is if you make another transaction, it might fail because your initial authorization has removed too much space from the spending capability, and now the person can't actually pay for it, right? That could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. But I mean, when you say there's an API failure, you just mean that the actual APIs, for some reason, have failed that is unrelated to the payment itself.
Because you say we are using so much, like sometimes we are using so much APIs like Stripe, Atom, like UPI. Because of India, there is also UPI, like you can scan the QR code and directly pay from your application like Paytm, some other. So sometimes you pay the money, but the money is deducted from your bank, but it's after that we see failure from the API. So but like because why I know, because when I call to the customer care, they say after 24 to 72 hours we will receive the money back. So it's happened sometimes.
It happened. Yeah.
So how they handle? So that's my question. Like they you say they authorize, but the fund is on hold, but you see the error on your end. So when the authorized thing free, so you receive the money back.
Correct. What you could also do is you could implement a process that retries the capture, not the authorization, because if you keep authorizing, then you're going to just burn the card.
Yeah.
But you could retry a process you could set up a process to retry the capture, depending on the type of error that you're managing. Like if you get like a random API error, like timeout or unavailable or whatever, then you can assume that it's a momentary thing, and then you can try the capture again in a certain amount of time. What gets a bit difficult is if you have a customer that's looking at the terminal while you're doing this, then they've seen an error, right? They've received an error message, and they might be inclined to refresh the page and try to pay again.
I think this is not related to but this is also in cart. I have seen on YouTube, but this is from the company. They are dealing with the pay later method.
Sure.
You are paying right now, but the merchant is deducting from my card after like I have a flexibility to pay in installment.
Sure.
So how they handle the installment, like they are sending some notifications, but I don't know the whole scenario. I just see the ad. I think the payment gate is called Tamara. I think I seen on internet. So they are firstly when I tap my card, there is no tapping card. They are just have my information.
Mm-hmm.
So when I go to merchant, so I pay by that company like Tamara. So they deduct the amount from Tamara, but I have to pay to Tamara.
Yes.
In installment.
Correct. So Tamara is essentially the one providing you financing for your assets,
Okay.
and then you turn around and you pay them, right?
Yeah, but in installment. So
Yes.
how they handle so we also whenever I'm paying the money to the merchant, so we are also receiving because the payment always deduct once. In system we are generating an order only once.
Yes.
But the merchant is receiving the payment for if they are receiving 4 installments.
No, so the merchant gets one payment. The merchant probably gets paid by Tamara. So the merchant Tamara buys it for you. Tamara buys the asset and finances it for you, and you pay it back. And the way Tamara probably does this is when you make your initial transaction, Tamara gets a payment token or a tokenized payment method.
Okay.
And if that tokenized payment method is persistent, meaning they can reuse it, then they just reuse it at whatever agreed upon dates.
3 or 4.
Like every week, every 2 weeks, every so on, right?
So we are receiving every time when Tamara receives the payment. So every time they are sending webhooks to the system, or just they are receiving the money, they are not doing.
Well, the merchant got paid. right?
Okay.
The merchant doesn't care anymore. It's done.
Okay.
Right now, what Tamara's doing is just getting their money back with
Yeah.
either interest or fees, depending on how it
Yeah,
works.
yeah, daily needs. Okay, got it.
Perfect.
Because this is new thing I see, like right now it's like booming right now. like,
Yes.
The pay later things. But I
No,
didn't-
the buy now pay later is huge. The credit card companies and the banks now are getting into BNPLs.
Okay.
Before it was just companies like Klarna and so on that were doing this, but because there's a lot of money to be made or a lot of, let's say, value to get, they're getting into it themselves too, which is difficult because it's like undercutting all those like, let's call them startups, because banks and credit cards have massive amounts of resources that these guys can't necessarily easily compete. So if you guys noticed, not too long ago, all those BNPLs went down in value. So, but I think they're going up now. Any other questions? Shoot.
Yeah, before you were talking about webhooks and duplicates.
Yes.
So what do you mean about duplicates?
Well, this was what I was mentioning is if your front end is competing with your back end or your server that's receiving webhooks. So if you make a payment, you have an iframe, let's say, and the iframe executes a transaction call to the gateway. Gateway returns essentially the final confirmation that the transaction was done successfully. You get that back, and then you're creating your payment through that process. But if at the same time you're getting a webhook, because you could subscribe to webhooks, and webhooks will still tell you payment successful, even if your front end knows it's successful.
Okay.
So you might have your front end creating a payment, while your back end is processing a webhook that's telling him, hey, payment created. So you want to make sure that you're not creating duplicates. The duplicate won't cause a consumer-facing problem because they're not going to be billed twice, but it's going to cause a reporting problem on your platform because you're going to show your direct customer that is using your product. That's the one, let's say your merchant, your cupcake store that is using your platform to sell its cupcakes to the outside world. They're going to see, oh, I got 2 payments, right, from Raphael, but really they just got it once.
Okay.
Yes, multiple questions.
Okay.
One thing related, kind of related topic is accounting.
Sure.
So do you know, like, especially for Stripe, in terms of accounting, if they have a direct integration for accounting or a way to do accounting directly on Stripe?
I don't know. That's a good question. I know Stripe supports invoicing and bill management. I don't know if they can do accounting. I imagine that you can connect a lot of the big accounting platforms to Stripe. Some of them, yeah, I would think so, but don't quote me. Honestly, that part I don't know.
Next question. Regarding the subscription, especially with Stripe, if you have a subscription payment, do you know if you have to manually tell Stripe every time, or
you can, but Stripe can do that too. A lot of gateways offer recurring payment services, so you can manage it yourself on your tool by tokenizing and storing a persistent token and kind of having the subscription data model and processing on your side. And like every month, you make a one-time transaction for the amount that the person has agreed, or you can probably create the subscription on the gateway side or the processor side or the whatever side and have them deal with it. And you get a webhook event most likely every month when the transaction is either like created, authorized, captured, successful, failed, whatever.
Okay.
So you could it depends on your business model, it depends on what you want to do, right? You can either offload it to the provider or you can manage it yourself.
Okay, you could do both. Okay.
Yeah, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Like, for example, let's say you're trying to create the capability to generate payment arrangements, like a BNPL. You're trying to create a BNPL-like experience. Then since that is the core of your business, you should probably manage the installments. If you're selling, I don't know, you're selling a SaaS service, right? You're selling something, access to something that costs $30 a month, then maybe you don't care about this stuff because it's really not part of your core services, and let somebody else that's invested a ton of money in building it take care of it, right?
Okay. Yeah, so you can have both and you can choose based on your needs. And last question is regarding the information when you purchase. So each merchant demands different information. Some will ask for the address, some will ask for the CVV, some will ask for the card and the full name. Some won't even care about the full name.
True.
So what makes it that it's different? Is it that every payment is different, or every bank is different, or what makes it that every merchant will ask different information?
So I don't think it's so much the merchant that asks different information. It's probably the services that the merchant is using that require different information, right? An example is if you take, for example, so let's take Worldline. Worldline is a payment gateway. Worldline was previously called Bambora. Worldline will underwrite a merchant, create an account, and that merchant can decide if they want to enable what's called AVS. AVS is like an address verification. It's to ensure that the person putting in the card information also has the address at which that card was initially registered. And you can choose to either reject the transaction on AVS failure, or you can choose to still charge it, right? So it's a risk situation, right? For example, if I'm selling an asset, you buy it, and then I ship it to you, then I want to mitigate fraud and chargebacks because you've already gotten the asset, right? I've delivered it to you. I'll recognize a loss. So maybe I want to have something called address verification in place because I want to make sure that there's limited risk of something happening. But any additional option you enable always adds more friction in the transaction, right? Because you might forget the address, you might not remember the postal code, you might live in a rural area that doesn't really have the same kind of address makeup that's recognized by the provider. So it really depends on what you're trying to. I think at some point it's at the merchant level. The merchant can decide what they want to enable or disable, and then it can also be at the underwriting level based on the risk. What do I want to? What information do I want to get to mitigate the risk of fraud and chargebacks?
Right. That would be. I think when you make the request, you get a response message on each payment, and that could be AVS failure or CVV failure or card.
You usually get that at the authorization level. Like when you authorize the card, that's when you send in the address, and then at that point you get a failure. And if you're set up to break on failure, then that'll be the end of the authorization. It'll be like it'll be a zero. But if you're set up to decide how you can manage it, meaning you get the authorization, you have a response that says AVS failure, you can decide to void the authorization, or you can decide to move forward and accept the risk. Any other questions?
If I may ask, so
you may.
You spoke about buy now, pay later.
Yes.
You said that it's booming. Is it booming because, why is it booming? Is it a free service because there's a third party coming in? Isn't it more expensive to have a third party coming in who is going to charge installment and things like that?
So,
like the person purchasing the item, if they are not paying right now, do they end up paying more than what they would have paid?
Yeah, of course. It's like,
so it's not free. So why is
no,
it
nothing
then?
is free. So buy now, pay later are sometimes free for the consumers, and it's the merchant that pays. For example, the merchant might pay. So I think I don't know all the different models, but the way it works is that the merchant wants to sell its products, right? And say your product has a 30% margin, right? Like you're selling a $100 computer, and it's the computer actually, 30% is okay. The computer actually costs $70, and you make $30 on it. You put it in the hands of somebody, and on average, factoring in delinquencies, using a BNPL, you're going to get $90 back. You're still getting $20, right? So for you, the risk of losing these transactions, the risk of losing the transactions is worse than the risk of a few people not paying or finishing their commitments. So you still get your product out, you still get a certain profit margin in, and the rest is just the acceptable loss, cost of doing business. That could be one way of seeing the things, right? Because the merchant does, it's better to get a 20% margin than to get no margin, right?
And also the merchant also make money if the person don't pay the installment on time. So
it depends. The person who makes money in your case might be the BNPL service provider.
Yeah.
They're the ones, because at this point you are now a customer of the BNPL. You're not a customer of the merchant anymore.
Yeah.
Right? So the BNPL might be free. Like, so for example, if you go to a store and you buy like your appliances, and they say it's the no interest payments for 24 months.
Yeah.
It really is no interest payments until you miss a payment. So, and some of them, the way it works is it balloons to the end. So you have 12 months to pay. And if by the end of the 12 months you are $100, in the hole, then all the unrealized interest comes down and hits you like a ton of bricks. And so, and that's how on average they make their money, right? Because
if they miss the installment, they have to pay money after that.
yes.
So they are also making.
Yeah. So the BNPL is the one charging interest, and that's how they make a bit of money probably from the merchant side. So the merchant pays for the capability of selling their assets to people who are not able to pay the full amount or don't want to pay. A lot of people can pay the full amount. They just choose to pay over interest for things like cash flow management, right?
Yeah.
Sure. Any questions from you, Andy? Did I miss any? Did I miss anything? No? Thank you. Thank you.